Welcome back, and now it's time to use the internet. What could possibly go wrong? So up until now we've been using mock data. How might we reach out to the internet for our car parts? Well, our car parts currently asks our service for data. So it's really inside the service that we want to fetch the appropriate data from the internet and return that back onto our template. Before we get into it, it's important that you understand how Angular loads first in our browser and then loads data. So when our browser first tries to access our website, it sends back HTML, CSS, it loads up Angular, and then when it's done loading, it'll go back and fetch API data like car parts, and then our server sends back JSON, which then loads into our page. Let's go through the steps needed to make this happen. First, we need to create a JSON file with car parts data. We'll call it carparts.json. Then we'll ensure our application includes the libraries it needs to do HTTP calls. Then we'll tell our injector about the HTTP provider. Then we'll inject the HTTP dependency into our service and make the GET request. And lastly, we'll listen for data returned by this request inside our car parts component. The first step is easy. We just brought over our mock data into our carparts.json file, but I've wrapped our array in an object to make it feel a little more realistic in that data object. So we'll have to keep that in mind, that to get to the data, we need to go through that data keyword. Next, we need to make sure we're including the right libraries. The HTTP library provides the GET method we'll need to call out to the internet, and the RxJS library stands for ReactiveX and provides some advanced tooling for our HTTP calls. If you use that 5-minute quick start, well, it's already including these libraries. You don't need to worry about it. Step 3 is we need to tell our dependency injector that it can inject the HTTP service. To do this, we're going to go inside our main.ts file, and inside here, we will import the HTTP module. Then we'll include the library by simply adding it to our list of imports. Do we need to also add it to our providers list? Well, it turns out we don't, because it's already getting added as a provider inside of the HTTP module. Let's take a look. If we dive under the covers of the HTTP module, we'll see in there's another ng module decorator, and inside it declares a list of providers, one of which is HTTP. Now we'll be able to inject the HTTP library where we need it. Time to inject it and use it to call out to the internet. So first we need to import our HTTP library as well as a part of the ReactiveX library. We just need map in this case. Then we'll create a constructor so we can inject HTTP as a dependency. We can do this because our service class is injectable. If we weren't using the injectable decorator, then our service class couldn't have additional dependencies. Now, inside the car parts method, we'll write a bunch of code. And there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to split it out into multiple pieces and we'll go through it step by step. First, calling the GET method and fetching our JSON file. You might expect this to return a promise, but it actually returns an observable. Observables give us additional functionality on our HTTP calls, one of which is to treat the return value like an array, which leads us to the map method. We call the map method, and then we're saying for the data returned, do this to the response, and we're using the fat arrow. We call JSON on the response to parse the string into JSON, and the array we want, remember, is under that data keyword, so we call .data. Lastly, we tell our TypeScript compiler to treat what gets returned like an array of car parts. Back in our car parts component file, we need to change some code because our service now returns an observable object, and we need to subscribe to that stream and tell our component what to do when that data arrives. So we'll write subscribe, and when our car parts arrive, we'll set this.carparts, our local car parts array, equal to the data that we receive. If we called this up in a browser, we would see nothing. It would break, and it would give us this error, cannot read property length of undefined. And it comes down to this line of code. This.carParts, well, is undefined, and underneath the covers, it's trying to call .length on it. Well, remember that graph I showed you at the beginning of this section? Angular loads, and then it evaluates the code, but we haven't called out to get our data yet. So it's calling this.carParts.length, but this.carParts is currently undefined. So we need to make sure that this.carParts is an array before we try to use this for loop. One way to solve this problem is to use the array's isArray function to make sure this.carParts is an array before we try to loop over it. Now if we jump back into our browser, we can see that we can now increment and decrement our different car parts, all loaded across the internet. Before we move on to challenges, I've got a few last thoughts. First of all, we didn't put any error handling in this code, and if you're actually calling across the internet to a data API, you're going to want to code in error handling to make sure you fail gracefully when that API doesn't work. Also, since we isolated our network calls as a service, we could easily write a racing data service mock and inject it when we're testing or developing offline. Lastly, observables are really cool, and they're worth learning about if you do lots of HTTP calls. So what did we learn in this section? Well, Angular apps usually load data using service classes after the application is initialized and running. We can use the HTTP library through dependency injection to make internet calls, and our HTTP calls return an observable, not a promise, which behaves more like an array. So why don't you get your hands dirty in the challenges, and I will see you in the outro video. Still kind of sucks. No. So this is great. And wow, if I read that, I wouldn't understand. Just try to put it in my own words. Cool.
These are your own words.
Oh, that's one way to do it. That's hilarious.
Excuse me.
All right, I like it. I like it.